I used to believe that vulnerability was strength, that opening your heart to someone meant you were brave. But sitting in that sterile office with its fake plants and motivational posters, vulnerability became my downfall. My name is Maya Chen, and I'm the woman who trusted the wrong person with my deepest fears, only to have them weaponized against me. But let me tell you about the moment I discovered that sometimes the people meant to heal you are the ones who break you the most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through my apartment window as I sat cross-legged on my meditation cushion, trying to center myself before another day of pretending everything was fine. My phone buzzed with another text from David, my boyfriend of 3 years, and I felt that familiar knot form in my stomach. "We need to talk when I get home," it read. 4 words that had become the soundtrack to our relationship lately. 4 words that made my chest tight and my hands shake. I was 29, working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm in Portland, living in a cozy 1-bedroom apartment that I'd carefully decorated with plants and artwork I'd collected over the years. My life looked perfect from the outside. Instagram-worthy breakfast bowls, weekend hikes with friends, creative work that paid the bills. But underneath the carefully curated surface, I was drowning. David and I had met at a coffee shop 3 years earlier. He was charming, successful, working in finance with his tailored suits and confident smile. I was immediately drawn to his certainty, the way he seemed to have everything figured out while I was still trying to navigate my 20s. He made decisions quickly, knew exactly what he wanted, and for a while that felt like a relief. Someone who could take charge while I focused on my art and my career. But somewhere along the way, his confidence had morphed into something else. Something that made me question every decision I made, every thought I had, every reaction I felt. When I got excited about a new project at work, he'd remind me not to get my hopes up because disappointment was inevitable. When I wanted to spend a weekend with my friends, he'd point out how I was neglecting our relationship. When I cried during movies or got emotional about things that mattered to me, he'd shake his head and tell me I was too sensitive or overreacting. The worst part was that he wasn't mean about it. He never yelled or called me names. Instead, he delivered these observations in a calm, matter-of-fact tone that made me believe he was just being rational while I was being irrational. He'd wrap his criticisms in concern, telling me he was worried about my emotional instability or my tendency to overthink things. He made me feel like he was the steady, logical one trying to help his dramatic, unstable girlfriend get her life together. I started second-guessing everything. Was I too emotional? Was I overthinking? Was I the problem in our relationship? The questions consumed me, following me to work, into my friendships, into every quiet moment when my mind had space to wander. I found myself apologizing constantly for things that weren't mistakes, walking on eggshells around him, trying to be the calm, collected girlfriend he seemed to want. My friends noticed the change. Emma, my college roommate who'd moved to Portland the same time I did, would give me concerned looks when David would correct me in front of others or dismiss my opinions during group conversations. "Maya, you know you don't have to agree with everything he says, right?" she'd ask gently. But I'd brush off her concerns, telling her she just didn't understand our dynamic, that David was actually really supportive and was just trying to help me grow as a person. My sister Jessica called from Chicago regularly, and I could hear the worry in her voice when I'd tell her about our latest discussion about my behavior or my choices. "He sounds pretty controlling, Maya," she said one evening after I'd described how David had explained to me why my decision to take a pottery class was a waste of money and time. Healthy relationships don't involve one person constantly correcting the other. But I defended him. I had to. If I admitted that Jessica and Emma were right, then I'd have to face the possibility that I'd been living in a situation that was slowly eroding my sense of self. It was easier to believe that they just didn't see the full picture, that David really did love me and want what was best for me. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in November. I'd had a particularly good day at work, landing a new client and receiving praise from my boss for a campaign I'd designed. I was excited to share the news with David, practically bouncing on my toes as I waited for him to come home. When he walked through the door, I launched into my story, describing the client meeting and how well the presentation had gone. He listened with his arms crossed, his expression growing more skeptical as I talked. When I finished, he sighed and set down his briefcase. "Maya, I don't want to burst your bubble, but you're getting way too excited about this. It's just one small client. You're setting yourself up for disappointment if you make this bigger than it is. Something inside me cracked. Why can't you just be happy for me? I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. I am happy for you, he said in that patient tone that I'd grown to hate. I'm just trying to keep you grounded. You have this pattern of getting overly emotional about things and then crashing when they don't work out the way you imagined. I'm trying to protect you from that. I'm not being overly emotional, I said, feeling tears start to form. I'm just excited about something good that happened at work, and there you go again, he said, shaking his head. Getting defensive and emotional instead of just listening to what I'm saying. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Maya. You can't handle any kind of feedback without falling apart. I stood there in our kitchen, surrounded by the life we'd built together, feeling completely alone. The tears came then, hot and angry and frustrated, and I hated myself for proving his point. I hated that I couldn't control my emotions, couldn't be the composed, rational person he wanted me to be. I hated that every conversation felt like a test I was destined to fail. That night, as David slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering when I'd become someone I didn't recognize. When had I stopped trusting my own instincts? When had I started believing that my emotions were wrong, that my reactions were inappropriate, that my excitement about good things was somehow problematic? I remembered the woman I'd been before I met David. She had opinions she wasn't afraid to share. She got excited about small victories and didn't apologize for feeling deeply about things that mattered to her. She trusted herself, believed in her own perceptions, stood up for what she thought was right. I missed her desperately, but I couldn't figure out how to find my way back to her. Emma suggested therapy. Maybe talking to someone neutral would help you figure out what you want, she said over coffee one Saturday morning. I'd been telling her about another fight David and I had, this one about my decision to buy a new camera for a photography hobby. I'd been wanting to explore. He thinks I'm impulsive with money, I explained. Maybe he's right, maybe I should have talked to him first. Emma leaned forward, her expression serious. Maya, you have your own income, you're allowed to spend your own money on things that make you happy. The fact that you think you need permission for that is. She trailed off, but I could see the concern in her eyes. Is what? I pressed. It's not healthy, Maya, it's just not. That afternoon, I found myself Googling therapists in Portland. I told myself I just needed someone to help me work through my emotional issues, to teach me how to be more rational and less reactive. I convinced myself that therapy would help me become the person David needed me to be, the person who could handle feedback without crying, who could make decisions without getting overwhelmed, who could be in a relationship without being so needy and dramatic. I found Dr. Amanda Richardson's profile on a psychology website. She specialized in anxiety and relationship issues, had excellent reviews, and her photo showed a professional-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. Her bio mentioned her commitment to helping women build confidence and healthy relationship patterns. It seemed perfect. Our first session was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. I sat in the waiting room of her downtown office, surrounded by other people who looked just as nervous as I felt. The space was designed to be calming, with soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and the kind of generic inspirational artwork you find in medical offices everywhere. Richardson called my name. I followed her into her office, a modest room with 2 chairs facing each other, a small table between them, and a window that looked out onto the busy street below. Dr. Richardson was exactly what I'd expected from her photo. Professional, composed, with the kind of measured way of speaking that made her seem wise and trustworthy. She asked me to tell her what had brought me to therapy, and I launched into what had become my rehearsed explanation of my problems. I think I have issues with emotional regulation, I said, fidgeting with the sleeves of my sweater. My boyfriend David points out that I get too emotional about things, and I think he's right. I overreact to situations, I get defensive when he gives me feedback, and I have trouble staying calm during disagreements. I want to learn how to be more rational and less reactive. Dr. Richardson nodded, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. Tell me more about these situations where you feel you're overreacting. I described the incident about my work success, the camera purchase, the pottery class, and dozens of other moments where David had helped me see that my responses were inappropriate or excessive. As I talked, Dr. Richardson continued to nod and take notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific situations. "It sounds like David is very observant about your patterns," she said when I finished. "It's good that he's willing to point these things out to you. Many partners avoid difficult conversations." Something in her tone made me feel both validated and ashamed. Validated because she seemed to understand that David was trying to help me, ashamed because she was confirming what I'd feared was true about myself. "I just want to learn how to be better," I said. "I love David, and I want our relationship to work, but I know I need to change some things about myself." "Change is hard work," Dr. Richardson said, "but I think we can definitely help you develop better coping strategies and communication skills." Over the next several weeks, our sessions followed a similar pattern. I'd describe situations from my relationship with David, and Dr. Richardson would help me analyze my role in creating or escalating conflicts. She taught me breathing techniques for managing anxiety, challenged me to think before reacting emotionally, and assigned homework exercises designed to help me practice staying calm in triggering situations. But something felt off. Instead of feeling more confident and self-assured, I found myself becoming more anxious and self-critical. I started monitoring my emotions constantly, second-guessing every reaction, apologizing even more frequently than before. I'd catch myself getting excited about something, and immediately try to tone it down, worried that I was being too much again. Dr. Richardson seemed to notice my increased anxiety, but interpreted it as resistance to change. "Growth is uncomfortable," she'd remind me when I expressed frustration with the process. "You've had these patterns for a long time. It's natural that changing them would feel strange at first." Meanwhile, things with David weren't improving. If anything, they were getting worse. Despite my efforts to implement the strategies Dr. Richardson had taught me, David continued to find fault with my behavior. When I tried to use the breathing techniques during our arguments, he accused me of being manipulative and fake. When I worked to stay calm during his feedback, he said I was being cold and shutting him out emotionally. "I don't know what you're doing in therapy," he said one evening after I'd tried to use a communication technique Dr. Richardson had taught me, "but it's making you weird and artificial. You used to be authentic, even if you were emotional. Now you're like a robot trying to pretend to be human." I felt trapped between two impossible standards. Dr. Richardson wanted me to be more controlled and rational. David wanted me to be authentic, but also calm and receptive to his guidance. I couldn't figure out how to be both, and I was exhausted from trying. The sessions with Dr. Richardson began to take on a different tone. When I expressed frustration with David's continued criticism, despite my efforts to change, she'd gently redirect the conversation back to my own behavior and responses. "Maya, we can only control our own actions," she'd remind me. "Instead of focusing on what David is or isn't doing, let's look at how you can continue to grow and improve your own patterns." When I mentioned that some of my friends had expressed concern about my relationship, Dr. Richardson would ask me to consider whether I was seeking validation for unhealthy behaviors, rather than genuine support for positive change. "Sometimes the people closest to us have invested in seeing us stay the same," she said during one session. "Change can be threatening to others, especially when it means you're becoming more self-aware and less reactive. Are you sure your friends are giving you advice that's really in your best interest?" I started doubting Emma and Jessica's concerns. Maybe they were threatened by my growth. Maybe they preferred the old version of me, who complained about my problems but never actually worked to fix them. Maybe Dr. Richardson was right, and I needed to focus on my own development rather than seeking external validation for my victim mentality. The turning point came during a session in late January. David and I had been having more frequent arguments, and I was struggling to understand why the techniques I'd learned weren't working. I'd been seeing Dr. Richardson for about 4 months, and while I felt like I understood my patterns better, I didn't feel any happier or more confident in my relationship. "I'm trying really hard to implement everything we've talked about," I told her, "but David still seems frustrated with me most of the time. Last week, he told me that I'm becoming more difficult to live with, not less. He said therapy is making me more self-absorbed and defensive." Dr. Richardson leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Maya, I want you to consider something. You've been working very hard on yourself these past few months, and that's commendable. But change is a two-way street in relationships. Have you considered that maybe David is resistant to your growth because it challenges the dynamic you two have established? For a moment, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe it wasn't all my fault. Maybe David did need to make some changes too. But then again, Dr. Richardson continued, we have to be honest about your progress. You're still very focused on external validation, still looking for others to tell you that you're okay instead of developing your own internal sense of self-worth. And you do tend to intellectualize your emotions, rather than really sitting with them and understanding what they're telling you. The hope deflated as quickly as it had arrived. She was right. I was still looking for validation, still avoiding the real work of changing my fundamental patterns. What do you think I should do?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I asked. Dr. Richardson was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was gentler than usual. Maya, I'm going to say something that might be difficult to hear, but I think you need to consider it seriously. I braced myself, expecting another insight about my defensive patterns or my tendency to avoid accountability. Have you considered that maybe David is right to want to leave you? The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs, felt my heart start to race, felt that familiar tightness in my throat that meant tears were coming. I don't understand, I managed to say. You've been in therapy for 4 months, Dr. Richardson said, her tone clinical and detached, and while you've gained some intellectual understanding of your patterns, you haven't made significant behavioral changes. You're still reactive, still seeking external validation, still struggling with the same issues that brought you here. David has been patient with this process, but his frustration is understandable. Sometimes relationships run their course, and continuing to hold on when someone is clearly unhappy isn't fair to either person. I stared at her, feeling like I was falling through space. This was my therapist, the person I'd been paying to help me, the professional I'd trusted with my deepest insecurities and fears, and she was telling me that my boyfriend's desire to leave me was justified. But I started, then stopped. What had I thought? That she was supposed to help me feel better about myself. That she was supposed to support me unconditionally. Maybe that was naive. Maybe real therapy was about hearing hard truths, even when they hurt. I know this is painful, Dr. Richardson continued, but sometimes we have to face reality. You came here because you recognized that you had patterns that were damaging your relationship. Despite months of work, those patterns persist. David's frustration is a natural response to being in a relationship with someone who says they want to change, but doesn't follow through. I sat there absorbing her words, feeling a familiar shame wash over me. She was right. I hadn't changed enough. I was still the same overly emotional, defensive, needy person I'd been when I started therapy. David deserved better. He deserved someone who could actually grow and change, someone who didn't require so much patience and understanding. The rest of the session passed in a blur. Dr. Richardson gave me some homework exercises about accepting difficult realities and learning to let go of relationships that weren't serving my growth. I nodded and took notes, but inside I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped out everything essential and left only an empty shell. I drove home in a daze, Dr. Richardson's words echoing in my mind. Maybe David is right to want to leave you. Maybe David is right to want to leave you. Maybe David is right to want to leave you. When I got home, David was sitting at our kitchen table with his laptop open, working on something that looked important. He glanced up when I came in, and I could see the question in his eyes. How was therapy? He asked. For a moment, I considered telling him what Dr. Richardson had said. Part of me wanted to share the pain, to have him comfort me and tell me that she was wrong, that he didn't really want to leave me. But a larger part of me knew that would just prove her point about my neediness and my inability to handle difficult truths on my own. It was good, I said instead. We talked about some important things. He nodded and went back to his laptop, and I went to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror across the room. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger. When had I become someone who believed that the person who was supposed to help her heal would tell her she deserved to be abandoned? That night, I lay awake again, but this time the thoughts racing through my mind were different. Instead of questioning my own perceptions and reactions,
I found myself questioning something else entirely. Was it normal for a therapist to tell someone that their partner was right to want to leave them? Was that really therapeutic, or was it something else? For the first time in months, I felt a tiny spark of the woman I used to be, the woman who trusted her own instincts and wasn't afraid to ask difficult questions. And that woman was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the person who was supposed to be helping me heal was actually making everything worse. But I pushed that thought away. Dr. Richardson was a professional. She had training and expertise that I didn't have. If she thought David was right to want to leave me, then probably he was. If she thought I wasn't making enough progress, then probably I wasn't. Who was I to question someone with a psychology degree and years of experience? Still, as I finally drifted off to sleep, that tiny spark refused to be completely extinguished. Somewhere deep inside, a voice I'd been ignoring for too long whispered that something about this whole situation wasn't right. Something about the way Dr. Richardson spoke to me, the way she consistently sided with David's perspective, the way she made me feel smaller and more broken after every session, instead of stronger and more whole. I told myself to ignore that voice. After all, it was probably just another example of my defensiveness, my inability to accept difficult truths about myself. But as the weeks passed, that voice grew a little stronger, a little harder to dismiss, and eventually it would become loud enough that I'd have no choice but to listen. The following weeks passed in a strange, muffled haze. Dr. Richardson's words had lodged themselves so deeply in my consciousness that they colored every interaction I had with David, every moment of self-reflection, every conversation with friends. I found myself analyzing his expressions for signs of the inevitable departure she'd predicted, searching for evidence that he was planning his exit strategy. David seemed to sense my increased anxiety, but instead of offering comfort, he became more critical. When I burned dinner because I was distracted, he sighed heavily and said, "Maya, you're not even present anymore. It's like you're living in your own head." When I tried to initiate conversations about our future together, he'd change the subject, or give vague non-committal responses that left me feeling more uncertain than before. I threw myself into the homework assignments Dr. Richardson had given me, practicing acceptance of difficult realities, and working on what she called emotional detachment from outcomes. I read articles about codependency and anxious attachment styles, taking notes and highlighting passages that seemed to explain my flaws. I was determined to prove that I could change, that I could become the kind of person who deserved love and stability. But the more I worked on myself, the more isolated I felt. Emma and Jessica's calls went mostly unanswered because I couldn't bear to hear their continued concerns about my relationship. When Emma showed up at my apartment unannounced one Saturday morning, I felt caught off guard and defensive. "Maya, you look terrible," she said, studying my face with the kind of directness that had always made her a good friend, and sometimes an uncomfortable mirror. "When's the last time you slept through the night?" I couldn't remember. The truth was, I'd been surviving on maybe 4 hours of sleep most nights, my mind churning through conversations with David and sessions with Dr. Richardson, looking for clues about what I was doing wrong and how I could fix it. "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Just busy with work and therapy and everything." Emma followed me into the kitchen, where I made coffee with shaking hands. "How's therapy going? Really, you used to talk about it more, but lately you just shut down whenever I ask." I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the response I'd learned to associate with my defensive patterns. Dr. Richardson had taught me to recognize these moments as opportunities for growth, chances to practice staying open instead of closing off. "It's challenging," I said carefully. "Dr. Richardson is helping me see some difficult truths about myself. It's not always comfortable, but I think that's how real change happens." Emma was quiet for a moment, watching me fumble with the coffee maker. "What kind of difficult truths?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to tell her everything, to share the weight of Dr. Richardson's assessment, and get Emma's perspective. But I remembered what Dr. Richardson had said about friends being invested in keeping me the same, about seeking external validation instead of doing the internal work. "Just patterns I have in relationships," I said vaguely. "Ways I contribute to problems without realizing it." "Like what?" Emma pressed. I found myself repeating some of Dr. Richardson's language, being too reactive, seeking validation instead of developing internal confidence, having trouble accepting feedback without getting defensive. Emma's expression grew more concerned. Maya, those things you just described, they don't sound like you. At least they don't sound like the you I've known for 6 years. Maybe you didn't know me as well as you thought, I said, immediately regretting how harsh it sounded. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. It's just I'm learning that I haven't been as self-aware as I thought I was. Emma set down her coffee cup and turned to face me fully. Can I ask you something, and will you really think about it before you answer? I nodded, though I felt my defenses rising. Do you remember who you were before you started dating David? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? I mean, do you remember the Maya who started her own freelance design business in college? The one who organized that protest when the university tried to cut funding for the arts program. The one who drove 8 hours to be with me when my mom was in the hospital and stayed for a week even though you had deadlines. I did remember that person, but she felt like someone from a different lifetime. That was different. I was younger, less aware of my patterns. Or maybe, Emma said gently, you were more yourself. That afternoon, after Emma left, I sat in my apartment feeling more confused than ever. Her words kept echoing in my mind, competing with Dr. Richardson's assessments and David's criticisms. I tried to remember the last time I'd felt genuinely confident about a decision, the last time I'd expressed an opinion without immediately second-guessing myself. The last time I'd felt excited about something without worrying that my excitement was inappropriate or excessive. I couldn't pinpoint when that version of myself had disappeared, but I knew it had been gradual. A comment here, a correction there, months of being told that my instincts were wrong and my reactions were problematic. It was like emotional erosion, so slow and steady that I hadn't noticed until suddenly I was standing in a completely different landscape, wondering how I'd gotten there. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Working late tonight, don't wait up. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that we'd planned to cook dinner together. 6 months ago, I would have been hurt by the casual dismissal. Now I just felt relieved that I wouldn't have to navigate another evening of walking on eggshells. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Jessica. Maya, her voice was warm and surprised. I was just thinking about you. How are things? I don't know, I admitted, and something about saying it out loud made my throat tight with unshed tears. Jess, can I ask you something? Of course, anything. Do you think I'm too emotional? There was a pause, and I could almost hear Jessica choosing her words carefully. What do you mean by too emotional? Like, do I overreact to things? Do I get too excited or too upset about stuff that normal people would handle more calmly? Maya, you're one of the most emotionally intelligent people I know. You feel things deeply, but that's not the same as being too emotional. Your feelings have always seemed proportionate to me. Why are you asking? I found myself telling her about therapy, about Dr. Richardson's assessments, about David's ongoing frustrations with my behavior. As I talked, I could hear how it all sounded when I said it out loud, and something about Jessica's silence felt different from Dr. Richardson's analytical responses. Maya, Jessica said when I finished, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me, okay? Okay. The person you're describing, this overly emotional, defensive, needy person, that's not who you are. I've known you your whole life, and yes, you feel things deeply, but you've never been irrational or inappropriate about it. You've always been thoughtful and empathetic, and strong, and this therapist telling you that David is right to want to leave you. That's not therapy, Maya. That's not how therapists are supposed to talk to their clients. Something in my chest loosened slightly. Like a knot I'd been carrying was starting to unravel, but she's a professional, she has training. So do lots of people who abuse their positions. Jessica said firmly. Maya, I'm going to say something that might be hard to hear, but someone needs to say it. The way David talks to you, the way he makes you feel like you're constantly doing something wrong, the way this therapist is reinforcing those messages, none of that is normal or healthy. You deserve to be with someone who celebrates your emotions, not someone who makes you feel like you need to apologize for having them. After we hung up, I sat in my living room, feeling like I was seeing my life from outside my body. What if Jessica was right? What if the problem wasn't that I was too emotional, but that I was with someone who couldn't handle emotions? What if Dr. Richardson wasn't helping me grow, but was instead reinforcing David's narrative about my inadequacies?
The thought was terrifying, because it meant I'd been participating in my own emotional destruction. It meant I'd been paying someone to confirm my worst fears about myself instead of helping me heal. It meant I'd lost months of my life trying to become someone smaller, quieter, more palatable to people who didn't actually want what was best for me. I started researching therapist ethics online, something I probably should have done months earlier. What I found made my stomach drop. Therapists were supposed to be neutral, not to take sides in relationship conflicts. They were supposed to help clients develop their own sense of self-worth, not confirm that their partners were justified in wanting to leave them. They were supposed to create a safe space for exploration and growth, not reinforce patterns of self-doubt and shame. The more I read, the more I realize that Dr. Richardson had violated multiple ethical guidelines in our sessions. She'd consistently aligned herself with David's perspective, without ever questioning whether his expectations were reasonable. She'd reinforced my self-criticism instead of helping me develop self-compassion. She'd made statements that were designed to hurt rather than heal. I thought about all the sessions where I'd left feeling worse about myself, all the times she'd redirected my concerns back to my own failings, all the ways she'd made me doubt my own perceptions and instincts. This wasn't therapy. This was systematic emotional undermining disguised as professional help. The realization hit me like a wave of rage so pure and clean that I felt more like myself than I had in months. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't too emotional. I wasn't the problem. I was a woman who'd been systematically gaslit by her boyfriend and then had that gaslighting reinforced by someone who was supposed to help me heal from it. I grabbed my laptop and started typing. I found the website for the Oregon Board of Licensed Professional Counselors and began reading about the complaint process. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in months, it wasn't from anxiety. It was from adrenaline, from the rush of finally trusting my own instincts again. The complaint form was extensive, asking for detailed descriptions of unethical behavior, dates and times of incidents, and documentation of harm caused. I worked on it for hours, reconstructing our sessions from memory, documenting the pattern of emotional undermining that Dr. Richardson had disguised as therapy. As I wrote, I felt pieces of myself clicking back into place. The woman who had driven 8 hours to be with Emma during a crisis wouldn't have needed permission to buy a camera. The woman who had organized protests against university budget cuts wouldn't have apologized for getting excited about work successes. The woman who had started her own business in college wouldn't have accepted being told that her boyfriend was right to want to leave her. I'd been that woman once. I could be her again. When David came home that night, I was still at my laptop, finalizing my complaint. He looked surprised to see me up so late, and even more surprised by the expression on my face. "What are you working on?" he asked, setting down his keys and approaching the couch where I sat. "I'm filing a complaint against Dr. Richardson with the state licensing board," I said, not looking up from my screen. David's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "What? Why would you do that?" "Because she violated multiple ethical guidelines in our sessions. Because she told me that you were right to want to leave me instead of helping me work through my feelings. Because she consistently reinforced destructive patterns instead of helping me heal from them." "Maya, you're being dramatic," David said, his voice taking on that familiar patient tone. "Dr. Richardson was just being honest with you about areas where you needed to grow. That's what therapy is supposed to do." I looked up at him then, really looked at him, and saw something I'd been too afraid to see before. He wasn't concerned about my well-being. He was concerned that I was questioning the narrative that kept me small and malleable, and grateful for his tolerance of my supposedly problematic personality. "No," I said quietly. "That's not what therapy is supposed to do. Therapy is supposed to help people develop self-awareness and self-compassion, not convince them that they deserve to be abandoned." "You're overreacting," David said. "Again, this is exactly the kind of thing we've been working on in therapy." "We haven't been working on anything in therapy," I said, standing up and closing my laptop. "Dr. Richardson has been reinforcing your belief that I'm too emotional while I've been paying her to destroy my self-esteem." David's face hardened.
I can't believe you're turning this into some kind of conspiracy theory, instead of just accepting that maybe you have areas where you need to improve. I do have areas where I need to improve, I said. But being emotional isn't one of them. Getting excited about good things isn't one of them. Having opinions and instincts and reactions isn't one of them. So now it's my fault that you're not happy? David asked. I felt that familiar tug to apologize, to backtrack, to soothe his frustration and take responsibility for the conflict. But for the first time in months, I resisted it. I didn't say it was your fault, I said. But I'm not going to keep pretending that my emotions are the problem when the real problem is that you can't handle them. Maybe Dr. Richardson was right, David said, and there was something cold in his voice that I'd never heard before. Maybe I should just leave. Maybe we both deserve better than this. 6 months ago, those words would have destroyed me. They would have sent me into a spiral of apologies and promises to change and desperate attempts to convince him to stay. But sitting there with my complaint half finished on my laptop, with Jessica's words still echoing in my mind, with the memory of who I used to be finally surfacing again, they just made me sad. Sad for the time I'd wasted, sad for the woman I'd allowed myself to become, sad for the relationship I'd thought we had but that had never actually existed. Maybe you should, I said. David stared at me like I'd grown a second head. What? Maybe you should leave. If being with someone who has emotions is that difficult for you, maybe you'd be happier with someone else. You're not serious. I am serious. David, I've spent months trying to become someone you could love, and it's made me miserable. I don't want to be with someone who makes me feel like I need to apologize for being myself. We stared at each other across the living room, and I could see him recalibrating, trying to figure out which approach would work to get me back in line. The concerned boyfriend who was worried about my therapy progress. The rational partner who was just trying to help me grow. The wounded lover who couldn't understand why I was attacking him. But I was done being managed. I was done being a project to be fixed. I was done being grateful for the bare minimum of tolerance from someone who was supposed to love me. I'm going to stay at Emma's tonight, I said, moving toward our bedroom to pack a bag. Maya, you're being ridiculous, David called after me. You can't just run away every time we have a difficult conversation. I turned back to look at him one more time. This isn't running away, this is choosing myself for the first time in 3 years. That night, I lay on Emma's couch surrounded by the familiar comfort of someone who actually cared about my well-being, and finished my complaint against Dr. Richardson. When I hit submit, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: pride. Pride in trusting my instincts, pride in standing up for myself, pride in refusing to accept treatment that diminished my worth. I had no idea what would happen next. I didn't know if the licensing board would take my complaint seriously, if Dr. Richardson would face any consequences, if David would try to convince me to come back, if I'd have the strength to rebuild my life from the ground up. But for the first time in months, those unknowns felt like possibilities instead of threats. I was scared, but I was also awake. I was hurt, but I was also angry. And anger, I was learning, could be a gift when it finally pointed you toward the truth. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a coffee shop near my apartment when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Catherine Walsh from the Oregon Board of Licensed Professional Counselors. Miss Chen, I'm calling regarding your complaint against Dr. Amanda Richardson. We've completed our preliminary investigation, and I wanted to schedule a time to discuss our findings with you. My heart started racing. I'd submitted the complaint in a burst of righteous anger, but as the days passed, doubt had crept in. What if they thought I was overreacting? What if Dr. Richardson's version of events made me sound like an unstable ex-client with a vendetta? Of course, I managed. When would be convenient? Would tomorrow afternoon work? We'd like to meet in person if possible. The next day, I found myself in a sterile conference room at the licensing board offices, facing Catherine Walsh and 2 other board members. Catherine was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind but serious eyes. She opened a thick file and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Miss Chen, I want to start by thanking you for bringing this matter to our attention. Your complaint was very thorough and raised several serious concerns about Dr. Richardson's practice. I felt a flicker of validation, quickly followed by nervousness about what was coming next. We conducted interviews with Dr. Richardson and reviewed her case notes from your sessions. What we found was troubling. Catherine paused, choosing her words carefully. Dr. Richardson's documentation shows a pattern of therapeutic boundary violations and ethical breaches that extend beyond your case. My breath caught. Beyond my case. Your complaint prompted us to review other client files, and we discovered similar patterns of inappropriate alliance with abusive partners, reinforcement of client self-blame, and failure to maintain therapeutic neutrality. You weren't the only client who experienced this treatment. The room felt like it was spinning. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't oversensitive. There were other women who had gone to Dr. Richardson for help and instead had their trauma compounded by someone who was supposed to heal them. What happens now? I asked. Catherine's expression grew more serious. Dr. Richardson's license has been suspended pending a full ethics review. Based on the evidence we've gathered, it's likely that suspension will become permanent. She will not be able to practice therapy in Oregon, and this will be reported to the national database, making it difficult for her to obtain a license in other states. I sat there absorbing the magnitude of what Catherine was telling me. Dr. Richardson's career was over. Her ability to harm other vulnerable people was ended. Because I had trusted my instincts and spoken up. There's something else, Catherine continued. We'd like your permission to contact the other affected clients. Many of them may not realize that what they experienced constituted malpractice. Your complaint could help them understand that they deserved better treatment. I thought about other women sitting in Dr. Richardson's office being told that their partners were right to leave them, being convinced that their emotions were the problem, leaving sessions feeling smaller and more broken than when they arrived. Yes, I said without hesitation, please contact them. As I walked out of the building that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time, a deep sense of rightness, not happiness exactly, but a profound alignment between my actions and my values. I had trusted myself, and that trust had led to justice not just for me, but for other women who had been harmed. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Coffee later, I want to hear everything. Instead of the familiar anxiety about sharing my experience, I felt excited to tell her what had happened. Over the past few weeks, staying at Emma's had reminded me what it felt like to be around someone who celebrated my wins instead of minimizing them, who listened to my concerns without immediately redirecting them back to my flaws, who believed in my perceptions instead of questioning them. That evening, Emma and I sat on her balcony as I told her about the meeting with the licensing board. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Maya, do you realize what you did? She finally said. I filed a complaint. No, you did so much more than that. You trusted yourself when everyone around you was telling you not to. You stood up not just for yourself, but for other women you'd never even met. You chose truth over comfort, justice over compliance. That takes incredible courage. I felt tears start to form, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of shame or frustration. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of coming home to myself. I almost didn't do it, I admitted. I kept thinking maybe I was wrong, maybe I was being too sensitive. But you did do it. Despite all the gaslighting, despite months of being told your instincts were wrong, some part of you knew the truth and held on to it. That's remarkable, Maya. A week later, I was back in my apartment. David had moved out while I was staying at Emma's, leaving behind a note that managed to be both self-pitying and accusatory. He blamed me for destroying our relationship with my therapy obsession, and my refusal to accept feedback. Reading it, I felt nothing but relief that I no longer had to manage his emotions or take responsibility for his inability to love me as I was. My phone rang as I was unpacking the last of my things. It was Catherine Walsh again. Miss Chen, I wanted to give you an update. We've been able to contact 4 other former clients of Dr. Richardson's, and 3 of them have decided to file their own complaints. Your courage in speaking up has created a path for other women to seek justice. After we hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by the remnants of my old life and the possibilities of my new one. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, before David, before Dr. Richardson, before I'd learned to doubt every instinct and question every emotion. That woman felt both foreign and familiar, like meeting a childhood friend after years apart. My laptop was open on the coffee table, and on impulse, I created a new document and started writing. Not a complaint this time, but something else. A story about gaslighting disguised as love, about therapy that wounded instead of healed, about the long journey back to trusting yourself. As I wrote, I realized I wanted other women to read this story. I wanted them to know that their emotions weren't too much, that their instincts weren't wrong, that they deserved partners who celebrated their depth instead of shaming them for it. I wanted them to know that therapists who made them feel worse about themselves weren't practicing real therapy. I started a blog that night, writing under my real name with my real story. Within a week, the comments section was filled with women sharing their own experiences of emotional manipulation, of therapists who had betrayed their trust, of the long process of learning to believe in themselves again. One comment in particular stayed with me: "Thank you for writing this. I've been seeing a therapist who tells me my husband's criticism is justified, and reading your story made me realize that's not normal. I'm going to find a new therapist and maybe file a complaint too." 6 months later, I was sitting in the office of Dr. Maria Santos, a trauma-informed therapist who specialized in helping people recover from psychological abuse. Unlike Dr. Richardson's sterile office, with its generic motivational posters, Dr. Santos's space felt warm and lived in, with plants that were clearly thriving and artwork that seemed chosen with care. "How are you feeling about the progress you've made?" Dr. Santos asked during one of our sessions. I thought about the question seriously. The Maya who had first walked into Dr. Richardson's office had been desperate to be fixed, convinced that she was fundamentally flawed and needed professional help to become acceptable. The Maya sitting in Dr. Santos's office was someone different, not perfect, not without areas for growth, but not broken either. "I feel like myself again," I said. "Not the person I was before David exactly, but someone who incorporates everything I've learned while still trusting my own judgment." "That's significant growth," Dr. Santos said. "You've learned to hold complexity, to acknowledge areas where you want to grow without believing that you're fundamentally flawed." I nodded, thinking about how different this therapeutic relationship felt. Dr. Santos challenged me, but in ways that made me feel stronger, not smaller. She helped me examine my patterns without convincing me that my emotions were problems to be solved. She supported my growth while affirming my inherent worth. "I've been thinking about dating again," I admitted. "But I'm nervous about trusting my judgment with men." "What specifically worries you? What if I fall into the same patterns? What if I can't recognize the red flags early enough?" Dr. Santos leaned forward slightly. "Maya, you did recognize the red flags. With both David and Dr. Richardson, your instincts were working the entire time. The problem wasn't your judgment, it was that you'd been taught not to trust it." She was right. Even in the depths of my confusion, some part of me had known that something was wrong. That voice had gotten quieter under the constant criticism, but it had never completely disappeared. It was the voice that had eventually led me to file the complaint, to leave David, to reclaim my life. "Your job now isn't to develop better judgment," Dr. Santos continued. "It's to trust the judgment you already have." A year after filing my complaint against Dr. Richardson, I received a final update from the licensing board. Her license had been permanently revoked, and she was facing a civil lawsuit from several former clients. The investigation had revealed a pattern of malpractice spanning several years, affecting dozens of women who had sought help during vulnerable times in their lives. I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that she would never again be able to harm someone seeking healing. But more than that, I felt proud of the women who had come forward, who had chosen to trust their own experiences despite being told those experiences were invalid. My blog had grown into something larger than I'd ever imagined. I was invited to speak at conferences about recognizing therapeutic abuse, to write articles about the intersection of domestic violence and professional misconduct, to consult with licensing boards about improving oversight of mental health professionals. But perhaps the most meaningful response came in the form of personal messages from women who had read my story and found the courage to leave harmful relationships, to fire unethical therapists, to trust their own perceptions again. Each message reminded me that speaking our truth doesn't just heal us, it creates permission for others to heal too. I never did take Elise Navarro's job offer, that moment when silence became my weapon and truth became my power. Because sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't accepting someone else's validation of your worth, it's learning to validate yourself. Sometimes the loudest statement you can make isn't a shout, it's the quiet decision to trust your own voice, even when everyone around you is telling you it's wrong. I'm still learning to trust that voice, still practicing the art of believing in my own perceptions. But I know now that my emotions aren't too much, my instincts aren't wrong, and I don't need anyone's permission to take up space in the world. So tell me, have you ever had a moment when you knew something was wrong, but everyone around you convinced you otherwise? Have you ever trusted a professional who made you feel worse instead of better? Your story matters, and your voice deserves to be heard. Sometimes speaking up isn't just about seeking justice for yourself, it's about lighting a path for others who are still finding their way out of the darkness. 2 years had passed since that night I chose myself over everything I thought I wanted. I was standing in the conference room of a prestigious law firm in downtown Portland, looking out at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was higher up in a building than I'd ever been, both literally and metaphorically. Miss Chen, we're prepared to offer a settlement of $450,000, said Robert Manning, Dr. Richardson's attorney. He was a thin man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Across the table sat Dr. Richardson herself, older and more haggard than I remembered, her confident demeanor replaced by something that looked like defeat. My attorney, Sarah Kim, a sharp woman who specialized in professional malpractice cases, leaned back in her chair. My client will consider $600,000 plus a public statement acknowledging the harm caused to all affected clients. I watched Dr. Richardson's face as the numbers were discussed. She avoided eye contact, staring instead at her folded hands. This woman who had once held so much power over my sense of self, now looked small and diminished. I felt no satisfaction in her apparent distress, only a quiet sense of justice finally being served. The public statement is non-negotiable, Dr. Richardson's lawyer said quickly. My client cannot admit to intentional wrongdoing. Then we'll see you in court, Sarah replied smoothly. I'm confident a jury will be very interested in hearing about the systematic manipulation of vulnerable women seeking mental health treatment. During the recess, I stepped outside the conference room to call Emma. She answered on the first ring. How's it going? She asked, her voice full of concern and anticipation. They're trying to settle, I said. Sarah thinks we have them cornered. But honestly, Em, I'm not sure I care about the money anymore. What do you mean? I looked around the expensive law firm, at the marble floors and mahogany furniture, at the world I'd never imagined being part of. I mean, I already won. The moment I trusted myself enough to file that first complaint, I won. Everything else is just paperwork. Emma was quiet for a moment. Maya, do you remember what you said to me 3 years ago, right after you started therapy with Dr. Richardson? What? You said you just wanted to learn how to be someone David could love. And now listen to yourself. You're talking about winning because you trusted yourself. Do you hear the difference? I did hear it. The Maya who had desperately wanted to be fixed was gone, replaced by someone who understood that she had never been broken in the first place. The journey between those two versions of myself felt both impossibly long and surprisingly short. When we reconvened, Dr. Richardson's team had agreed to $575,000 and a carefully worded statement that acknowledged professional misjudgments without admitting intentional harm. Sarah looked at me questioningly, and I nodded. It was enough. As the paperwork was being finalized, Dr. Richardson finally spoke directly to me for the first time since we'd entered the room. I want you to know, she said quietly, that I genuinely believed I was helping you. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or deflection, but what I saw instead was something more complex. A woman who had convinced herself that her harmful actions were justified, who had perhaps become so invested in being right that she'd lost sight of her duty to do no harm. I believe you did think that, I said, but believing something doesn't make it true. And impact matters more than intent. She nodded slowly, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I felt like I was talking to her as an equal rather than as someone seeking her approval or expertise. That evening, I met Jessica for dinner at a small Italian restaurant near my apartment. She'd flown in from Chicago for the settlement conference, insisting she wanted to be there for this milestone. "I'm proud of you," she said, as we shared a bottle of wine and celebrated the resolution of the lawsuit. "But I'm also curious about something." "What's that? What's next for you? You've got this settlement money, your blog is successful, you're speaking at conferences, you could do anything. What do you want?" It was a question I'd been thinking about a lot lately. The settlement money meant I had financial security for the first time in my adult life. I could travel, go back to school, start a nonprofit, buy a house. The possibilities felt endless and slightly overwhelming. "I think I want to go back to school," I said. "Maybe study psychology or social work. Help other people navigate the mental health system more safely." Jessica smiled. "That makes perfect sense. You'd be amazing at that. But I'm also scared," I admitted. "What if I'm not cut out for it? What if my own experience makes me too biased to help others objectively?" "Maya, your experience doesn't make you biased, it makes you informed. There's a difference between letting your trauma control you and using your healing to help others heal." The conversation reminded me of something Dr. Santos had said during one of our sessions. "Your pain can become your purpose, but only after you've done the work to heal it. Otherwise, you're just spreading your wounds around." I'd been doing that work for 2 years now, learning to recognize the difference between my intuition and my anxiety, practicing setting boundaries without feeling guilty, developing the ability to be in conflict with someone without immediately assuming I was wrong. It was ongoing work, but it was work I was committed to. 6 months later, I was accepted into a master's program in clinical psychology at Portland State University. The acceptance letter arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, and I called Emma immediately. I got in, I practically shouted into the phone, "Maya, that's incredible, when do you start?" "Fall semester." I'm terrified and excited and proud all at the same time, as you should be. "You're going to change lives." The idea that I might change lives felt both thrilling and humbling. I thought about all the women who had reached out to me through my blog, sharing their stories of therapeutic abuse, of partners who had convinced them their emotions were wrong, of the long journey back to trusting themselves. If I could help even one person avoid what I'd gone through, or recover from it more quickly, the years of pain would feel worth it. My first day of graduate school was nothing like my first day in Dr. Richardson's office. Instead of feeling broken and desperate for someone else to fix me, I felt curious and eager to learn. My classmates were a diverse group of people who had come to psychology from different paths, many of them drawn by their own experiences with mental health challenges. During our first ethics class, Professor Williams asked us to think about why we wanted to become therapists. "For many of you," she said, "this desire comes from your own healing journey. That's not a weakness, it's a strength. But it also means you have a responsibility to continue doing your own work, to remain aware of your triggers and biases, to never stop growing." I thought about Dr. Richardson, wondering if she had once been a student sitting in a similar classroom, full of good intentions. At what point had she lost her way? When had helping others become about confirming her own worldview rather than serving her clients' needs?
After class, I approached Professor Williams. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. How do we make sure we don't become the therapists who hurt people instead of helping them?" She smiled, but it was a serious smile. "By staying humble, staying curious, and never believing we have all the answers. The moment you think you know what's best for someone else's life, you've stopped being their therapist and started being their controller." Her words stayed with me as I progressed through the program. I learned about trauma-informed care, about the importance of cultural competency, about the ethics of dual relationships and boundary violations. I studied different therapeutic modalities and practiced active listening skills. But perhaps most importantly, I learned to hold space for other people's experiences without trying to fix or change them. During my practicum year, I was assigned to work at a community mental health clinic that served low-income women. Many of my clients were survivors of domestic violence, and I found that my own experience helped me understand the complex dynamics of abusive relationships in ways that textbook knowledge alone couldn't provide. One afternoon, I was working with a client named Rachel,
who reminded me of myself 3 years earlier. She was intelligent, articulate, and convinced that she was the problem in her relationship. He says I'm too sensitive, Rachel told me, unconsciously echoing words I had once spoken in Dr. Richardson's office. Maybe he's right, maybe I do overreact to things. Instead of challenging her directly, I asked open-ended questions that helped her explore her own experiences. I reflected back what I heard without judgment. I validated her feelings while also gently questioning whether her partner's assessment of her emotions was the only possible interpretation. By the end of our session, Rachel was starting to consider the possibility that her emotions were valid responses to problematic behavior, rather than character flaws that needed to be corrected. You know, she said as she was leaving, you're the first therapist who's ever made me feel like maybe I'm not crazy. Walking to my car that evening, I felt a deep sense of alignment between my personal experience and my professional purpose. This was what I was meant to do. Not to fix people, but to help them remember that they were never broken in the first place. The final chapter of my graduate program was writing a thesis on therapeutic boundary violations and their impact on client recovery. I interviewed dozens of women who had experienced various forms of professional misconduct, from inappropriate self-disclosure to sexual boundary violations, to the kind of systematic emotional manipulation I had experienced with Dr. Richardson. What emerged from my research was a pattern of vulnerability being exploited by professionals who had lost sight of their ethical obligations. But it also revealed something hopeful: the remarkable resilience of survivors and their ability to not only heal from these experiences, but to use them as catalysts for positive change. On graduation day, I sat in the auditorium surrounded by my classmates and their families. Emma and Jessica were there, beaming with pride. Even my parents had flown in from California, finally understanding that their daughter had found her calling. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The scared, confused woman who had first entered Dr. Richardson's office, seeking validation for her existence, had evolved into someone who could help others find their own validation. The path had been longer and more painful than I could have imagined, but it had led me exactly where I needed to be. Dr. Santos was in the audience too. After the ceremony, she approached me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Maya," she said. "You've turned your pain into purpose in the most beautiful way." "I learned from the best," I replied, meaning it completely. That night, I updated my blog with a post about graduation and the next phase of my journey. Within hours, the comments section was filled with messages from women around the world who had been following my story. "Thank you for showing us what healing looks like," one woman wrote. "Thank you for proving that we can survive and thrive after betrayal." Another said, "I start therapy next week for the first time since my own experience with an unethical therapist. Your story gave me the courage to try again." These messages reminded me that our stories of survival and healing don't just belong to us. When we speak our truth, we give others permission to speak theirs. When we refuse to be silenced by shame, we create space for others to find their voices. 6 months later, I opened my own private practice specializing in trauma recovery and therapeutic betrayal. My office was everything Dr. Richardson's wasn't: warm, inviting, filled with actual living plants and artwork that reflected hope and possibility. On my desk, I kept a small sign that read, "Trust yourself. You know more than you think you do." It was a message I needed to remember as much as my clients did. The work of healing is never linear, never complete, never perfect, but it is always worth it, and sometimes, if we're lucky, our healing becomes a light for others who are still finding their way out of the darkness. Your voice matters. Your experience is valid, and you have everything you need inside yourself to heal and grow and thrive. Sometimes you just need someone to remind you of that truth. 5 years after opening my practice, I received an unexpected phone call that would bring everything full circle. The voice on the other end was tentative, almost whispered. "Dr. Chen, my name is Lisa Moreau. I found your number through your blog. I think I need your help." Lisa's story unfolded over several sessions, and it was hauntingly familiar. A controlling partner who disguised criticism as concern. A therapist who reinforced those messages instead of questioning them. A woman slowly losing herself while being convinced she was the problem. "He tells me I'm too emotional, just like my therapist does," Lisa said during our third session. "But when I read your blog, something clicked. I started wondering if maybe they're both wrong. Sitting across from Lisa, I saw myself from years ago, and I felt the profound responsibility of the moment. This woman had found me because I'd had the courage to share my story, to speak truthfully about my experience even when it felt terrifying. Now I had the opportunity to guide her toward the same healing I'd found. Lisa, what do you think? I asked gently. When you listen to your inner voice, what does it tell you about your emotions? She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her accessing something deep inside herself, something that had been buried under years of invalidation. It tells me that my feelings make sense, she said, finally, tears starting to flow. It tells me that anyone would be upset by the things he says and does. It tells me that I'm not crazy. That voice is worth listening to, I said. It's been trying to protect you all along. Working with Lisa and dozens of other clients over the years had taught me that healing isn't just an individual journey. When one person reclaims their truth, it creates ripple effects that extend far beyond their own life. Lisa eventually left her abusive partner and fired her unethical therapist. She started her own support group for women recovering from psychological abuse. She became an advocate for stronger oversight of mental health professionals. The work was deeply fulfilling, but it was also challenging in ways I hadn't expected. Some days I carried the weight of so many stories of betrayal and manipulation that I had to remind myself that healing was possible. Other days I marveled at the resilience of the human spirit, at the ability of people to not just survive but transform their pain into wisdom. Dr. Santos remained my supervisor and mentor throughout those years, helping me navigate the complex emotions that arose from doing this work. During one particularly difficult week, when I'd seen 3 new clients with stories similar to my own, I found myself struggling with anger toward the system that had failed them. I keep thinking about all the therapists out there who are harming people right now, I told her. How many Dr. Richardsons are sitting in offices convincing vulnerable people that they're the problem? Probably more than we'd like to admit, Dr. Santos said. But Maya, look at what you're doing about it. Every person you help, every story you share, every professional you train creates change. You can't save everyone, but you can light a path for others to follow. She was right. Through my practice, my blog and the workshops I'd started conducting for mental health professionals, I was creating the change I wanted to see. I'd developed training programs on recognizing and preventing therapeutic boundary violations. I'd spoken at conferences about the intersection of domestic violence and professional misconduct. I'd consulted with licensing boards on improving their complaint processes. But perhaps the most meaningful work happened in the quiet moments with individual clients, when someone learned to trust their own perceptions again, when they realized their emotions weren't too much, when they discovered their voice and decided to use it. One spring afternoon, I was preparing for a workshop I'd been invited to conduct at a local university when I received an email that stopped me in my tracks. The subject line read, "From a former colleague of Dr. Richardson." The sender identified herself as Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who had shared office space with Dr. Richardson years earlier. She wrote that she'd been following my work and wanted to meet in person to discuss something important. We met at a coffee shop downtown, and Dr. Walsh turned out to be a woman about my age with an earnest demeanor and worried eyes. "I want to start by saying how sorry I am for what you went through," she said immediately. "And I want you to know that your courage in speaking up prevented other women from being harmed." "Thank you," I said, wondering where this conversation was heading. "I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear, but I think you deserve to know." She took a deep breath. Dr. Richardson wasn't working alone. There was a whole network of therapists who were referring clients to each other, essentially enabling each other's harmful practices. My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Dr. Richardson would refer male clients who were struggling with difficult partners to Dr. Michael Stevens, who would reinforce the narrative that their girlfriends or wives were the problem. Then Stevens would refer the women to Dr. Richardson, who would work to make them more compliant and submissive. They called it family systems work, but it was really just systematic manipulation. I felt sick. David had never mentioned seeing a therapist, but suddenly his confidence in his assessment of my flaws made more sense. He hadn't just been gaslighting me on his own, he'd had professional validation for his behavior. "How do you know all this?" I asked. "Because I was approached to join their network." Dr. Walsh said, when I refused and started asking questions, I was ostracized from their professional circle. I tried to report them, but I didn't have enough evidence, and they were well connected in the local psychological community. Are they still practicing? Stevens lost his license 2 years ago after your complaint opened the door for other investigations. The network fell apart after Richardson was sanctioned, but Maya, there might be others. Other networks, other therapists who are weaponizing their authority to harm the people they're supposed to help. The conversation left me shaken, but also more determined than ever to continue my work. If there were organized efforts to manipulate and control vulnerable people under the guise of therapy, then there needed to be equally organized efforts to expose and stop them. That evening, I called Emma to process what I'd learned. It's horrifying, she said, but it also explains so much. Maya, you didn't just stumble into one bad therapist. You were deliberately targeted and manipulated by people who knew exactly what they were doing. It makes me angry, I admitted. But it also makes me realize how important this work is. How many other women are trapped in these systems right now? And how many of them will find their way out because of the path you've created, Emma reminded me. 6 months later, I published an article in a major psychology journal exposing the network of therapists who had been systematically manipulating clients. The article sparked investigations in multiple states and led to additional license revocations. More importantly, it raised awareness within the mental health community about how professional misconduct could be organized and deliberate rather than isolated incidents. The response to the article was overwhelming. I received messages from therapists who wanted to learn how to better protect their clients, from survivors who felt validated by seeing their experiences taken seriously, and from researchers who wanted to study the phenomenon further. But the message that meant the most came from Lisa, my former client who had gone on to become an advocate herself. Dr. Chen, she wrote, I want you to know that because of your work, I was able to help 3 women in my support group recognize that their therapists were harming them. They've all found new therapists and are healing. Your courage created a ripple effect that keeps expanding. Standing in my office that day, reading Lisa's message, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The broken woman who had walked into Dr. Richardson's office seeking validation had become someone who could validate others. The person who had been told she was too emotional had learned that emotions were information, not weaknesses. The woman who had been convinced she was the problem had discovered she was actually the solution. My story wasn't unique. Around the world, there were countless people who had been harmed by those they trusted, who had been told their truth didn't matter, who had been convinced they were broken beyond repair. But there were also countless stories of healing, of survivors who had reclaimed their voices and used them to create change. The work continues. Every day, I sit with people who are learning to trust themselves again. I train professionals who want to do better. I write and speak and advocate for stronger protections for vulnerable people seeking help. It's not always easy work, but it's sacred work. Your story matters. Your truth has power, and you have everything inside yourself that you need to heal and grow and thrive. Sometimes you just need someone to remind you of that truth, to hold space for your healing, to believe in your strength even when you can't feel it yourself. Trust yourself. You know more than you think you do, and your voice, when you're ready to use it, has the power to change not just your own life, but the lives of others who are still finding their way home to themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.